Hey, you made it back for the second half of the social judgment theory lecture. And if you skip the first part and are jumping here, shame, for shame. Actually, that's fine. If you've read the book, then perhaps this will make sense. But I really do encourage you, you need to listen to the first lecture and you need to read the book to make sense of this theory. That's why I add a lecture. It's not in place of the book, but I'm hoping that between the book and between me, this will begin to make more sense. If we were in class, it'd be easier for you to ask questions, but I'm doing this to really hit all of our bases as best I can. So here we are, Social Judgment Theory, Part 2, the examples. We ended the last lecture talking very briefly about judgments and ego, and I want to come back to that, spend a couple more minutes with it, and then jump into our examples. So judgments, there are three types of judgments, and judgments are about when you receive a message. So those latitudes, acceptance, rejection, non-commitment, those were your position on an issue. That's when you go into a conversation, when you hear a message, when you read something, when you watch a commercial, right, that's where you start out with, what you already are feeling. The judgment now, it's a judgment. You are judging. It's your response to that persuasive appeal. The thing you read, you saw, you heard, someone said to you, right? You're now going to have a judgment about it. And you may assimilate the judgment. So somebody says something and it sounds, what they're saying, yeah, that sounds right to you, right? That means your response or your judgment was an assimilation, right? You had an assimilation. A contrast, right? Assimilate means to become like something. And we'll talk about the ins and outs of that in a moment here, or in a few moments. Contrast is you say, no thank you, right? Goodbye, Felicia. I said good day, sir. I guess Felicia's a man now? I don't know. Anyway, so contrast is no thank you. So you have assimilation, where you hear something you think, yeah, that sounds right, that sounds good. Contrast is no thank you, and you just move on. And then we get boomerang, and the boomerang effect is when you say, what the frick? No way. And this is not merely that you say no thank you and you walk away from something, but it scares you away from them because it's just so WTF. You're like, no way. No. I'm sorry. My position was too goofy for me. It turns out I need to move further away from you because I don't want to be like you. It's a boomerang effect. And we're going to talk about how all that works in a few slides here. And I want you to remember what I said earlier, that ego involvement, right, skews and distorts it. So as you have greater ego involvement, you skew and distort the message. And by doing that, that increases how much you contrast and how much you assimilate, right? So just keep that in mind, that ego involvement now, it affects the size of anchors. We've discussed that. And it also is going to affect how much you contrast and you assimilate. So let me work through the examples of these concepts. We're going to return once more to this issue of tobacco bans, and we have this whole continuum at one end, ending all tobacco bans, right? So you can light up wherever you are, versus straight up outlawing tobacco at the other end. So here we have a series of latitudes, right? And you see if they're, like I said, these are a person's latitudes. They're latitudes of rejection, non-commitment, acceptance, etc. Right? Note the size of the anchor. This is a pretty big anchor. Because that anchor is so large, they're just accepting this one position here. They have rejected 1, 2, 3, 4 of the 7 positions, right? 4 of the 7 are being rejected, and they just have a fairly narrow range of things that they either accept or, are willing to consider. These non-commitments they're not sure about, they're willing to consider. That's because they have a strong anchor here, right? So this person, they may be that they associate this with an issue of personal and political liberty, perhaps, right? In terms of their values or attitudes or beliefs are affecting why that anchor is so large, right? It may be that they are a smoker, but they have some issues about the health impacts. I don't know, right? For some reason, they have high ego involvement. So they just have the 1 latitude of acceptance, 2 of non-commitment, but most is rejection, right? So again, what I said in the last slide, actually at the end of the previous lecture, greater ego involvement, greater, right, we're seeing a greater contrast of rejection and acceptance. They're rejecting a lot more. right? This also means that when they hear messages, when I talked about skewing and distorting information, if they hear information, right? So a piece of information comes in. I'm going to use a little I for information. A piece of information comes in and it lands right here on the line. See, it's just sort of on the line there between a rejection and a non-commitment, right? Right, given the size of their anchor, which is large, they're likely then to reject this information because there's a little bit of skewing and distorting. Again, large anchor, they skew and distort, and they end up rejecting more things. Because with this thing, it's sort of on the line, right? They could have put it in non-commitment, they could have put it rejection, but because they had that strong anchor, nope, they went and put it up here in rejection. Right? I'm hoping that makes sense. Let's look at the same example of tobacco and now just move to a different. This person has a smaller anchor, right? You see, let me get the red out here, right? You see right here, right? They have a smaller anchor. Because of that, they're actually accepting two positions, right? Their non-commitment covers two up here and one here. It's three positions. They're only rejecting two, right? Because they have a smaller anchor, right? Their anchor, which means probably that their ego involvement went down, right? Smaller anchor, their ego involvement went down, and that means that they had a broader range, right? A broader range of acceptance and non-commitment, of things that they're open to, either believe or non-commitment, they're open to the possibility of, is 5 of the 7 positions. This person probably doesn't really care if somebody smokes or not. They don't want to outlaw public smoking or to fine people for smoking in public, but otherwise, you can probably smoke in front of them or not. They probably do not care, right? They're probably also not a tobacco smoker or a tobacco user perhaps, because it just doesn't affect them, right? So smaller ego involvement, smaller anchor, much more open to a lot of different things. If we move to a different example, now I'm going to move. I talked about animal rights, I talked about tobacco, now I'm talking about guns, right? These are all issues on which people have a variety of feelings, and some care and some really don't, right? At the one end, we have outlaw all guns, right? Up here, guns bad. Down here is a more extreme position. It even goes to lifting carrying laws. This is somebody who really loves having lots of gun rights and fewer gun restrictions, right? So that's a continuum. Right? So when a person hears a message, right now we're talking about a judgment, are they going to assimilate, contrast, or boomerang? Well, this individual, again, talking about what we discussed before, large anchor, right? So you just accept the one position and they're rejecting most of what they hear. Right now they're going to reject most of what they hear. When they hear a message, right? When they hear a message that falls here, right, in their latitude of acceptance, right? Or a message that falls up that sounds sort of like outlawing handguns or leaving laws as they are, for which they have non-commitment for those, right? Those are non-commitment. They're likely to assimilate. You see what I drew over here, or inserted over here? In those cases, they're likely to assimilate. They're going to hear this message about why we should outlaw handguns and think, oh, yeah, that sounds about right to me, right? They're likely to assimilate, right? Or if someone says, by contrast, someone says we should just leave laws as they are, they might think, oh, yeah, again, that sounds right to me. They're going to assimilate that message. And the hope here is that by assimilating that message, because it falls into things that they already either believe or are open to, the hope here is that their acceptance is actually going to begin to sort of broaden out. This is me trying to sort of show the idea that acceptance now is going to sort of grow and get bigger and start cutting into these areas that had been non-commitment will now be areas of acceptance. Acceptance is actually going to get bigger now, right? Because they've assimilated it. This goes back to the thing I said at the very beginning of the first lecture. This theory is very much about the idea of finding common ground. Your message or a message landed right up in here, right? Or it landed somewhere up in here, right? It landed in these places where they're willing to listen, they're willing to consider From there, you can get them to assimilate it, to say, that sounds right to me, and to agree with you. But if your message has to do with outlawing handguns, lifting waiting periods, lifting gun type restrictions, they're going to say, no, 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 right? And here I've drawn, right? I've drawn a C there, right? I've drawn a C there for contrast, right? They're going to contrast that. They're just not going to buy into it. They're going to say, oh yeah, no, I don't believe in that. No, thank you. Change the channel, dismiss you, ignore you, whatever. Now, if you go so far as to say we should go and lift carrying laws for this individual, see, for this person, do you see how far it was from their acceptance? It was so far from what they accept. They don't just contrast it. Oh, no, 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 no. They do something we actually call boomerang, right? They have a boomerang effect. It scares them away. And in fact, what's likely to happen because of this, because what you're saying is so far from what they believe, you're likely to cause them actually to start cutting out things that were closer to it, and that way they move further away from you if that's where your message was, right? So again, a lot of drawing here has gotten sort of messy, but the idea is, based on what a person accepted, messages near what they accepted led them to assimilate. Messages outside of what they accepted caused them to contrast and just dismiss the message. And messages really far away may have scared them actually into moving further away from you. And let me demonstrate this in a different way. Now we're going to work through an example without any specifics of what the issue is. And so what I have here is Joe Schmo, plain Jane, and it's Joe Schmo again. So I want you to think of this as being, so this is Joe Schmo, this is him before, right? This is Joe Schmo before the message, and this is Joe Schmo after the message. Okay? So it's Joe Schmo before the message and Joe Schmo after the message, and the message is given to us by plain Jane. So as we look at Joe Schmo, again, we see he has a fairly large anchor right there, and that means he's just accepting the one position on whatever the topic is. I don't know, and doesn't matter here. Right? So then Jane gives her message, and it falls there. Right? Well, look at where it is. It's landing right here along in his non-commitment and his acceptance. Because of that, Joe hears it and says, oh, yeah, I mean, that sounds right. And again, go back to that principle I said of this theory about finding common ground. Her message lands partially in what he's already accepted and in the area of things that he's open to. She's found that common ground. Therefore, she's gotten him, anyway, he has now, he's assimilated to her. Do you see that? This is huge. This is really important in terms of persuasion. He now is accepting something he hadn't actually accepted before, right? He has assimilated. Because her message was so close, right? Because her message was so close to what he already believed, he was willing then to make that transition and that change to assimilate and be more like her, right? So this is assimilation. In terms of persuasion, when you want to persuade somebody, this is what you're going for. A message that starts out close to what they already believe in and takes it from there. Gets them to think more broadly. It moves them to you by inches, not by leaps, but by inches. Let's work through the scenario again. Joe Schmo, same anchor, everything. Again, his before and after. And plain Jane's message now, it's up here. Oh, boo, right? Her message falls right up here in one of his latitudes of rejection. So when he hears the message, he says, as we talked about, no thank you, right? And look, his after is the same. This is an example of contrast. He heard the message. He believed the message was dissimilar to what he believes, and so he just dismissed what she had to say. Nothing changed. Again, we're talking about ego involvement. I want to touch on that again briefly. So higher, you were talking about the contrast and assimilation effects, and that it also, there's a skewing here, right? Because it could have been if he had a smaller anchor, right? If his anchor had been smaller, he might have been willing to consider the message as being sort of close to his non-commitment, right? Because it's not that far away. But I'm afraid he was not willing to do that because, again, he has that high ego involvement, right? But again, the important takeaway here for you, he had a contrast effect. He's just dismissing her message because it fell in his attitude of rejection, right? Fell in his attitude of rejection, so he had a contrast judgment. In our third example, exact same setup. This time, plain Jane has the message that's all the way at the extreme, right? It's not even just sort of close to him, right? It's not even here, right? No, no, right? It's way up here. It's at the top there. And because of that, it's possible she could actually scare Joe away, right? Do you see what happened there, right? Do you see where his acceptance actually went further from her, right? In the before and after, he's now even less accepting of what she said. And a common example that we use, I can't remember if your book uses this or not, I've just forgotten now, uh, is that sometimes like animal rights activists used to sometimes throw red paint on people who wore fur, and that would make some people less likely to support the cause of animal rights activism, right? It scared them away, right? And this is what you call a boomerang. Your message was so strong and so intense, you actually scared people away from you, right? And that's because, again, this principle of social judgment theory is that to persuade people, we have to find common ground. There are places and times for extreme messages. It can be to get attention, to wake people up, to change complacency. But at the individual level, it is possible we may actually create a boomerang effect. And that, in not so short, is social judgment theory.